Welcome to Caribbean Tea. From St. Vincent, Kendall Morgan, in Georgetown, Guyana, Dennis Chabral, and I am Vivian Williams in New York. This is Caribbean Tea, the podcast where we stir the pot on the region's most pressing issues, social, legal, cultural, and political, with unflinching honesty and thoughtful analysis. In today's episode, Safeguarding the Ballot, Securing Electoral Integrity in 2025, we continue the critical conversation we began in our previous episode, Behind the Ballot, Avoiding Elections Chaos in 2025. That discussion revealed the fault lines in Guyana's electoral framework. Now we dig deeper. In Guyana, elections are never just about ballots. They are about trust. And right now, that trust is under intense scrutiny. The 2025 elections are fast approaching, and at the center of mounting concern is the state of the national voters list. Widely seen as bloated, outdated, and vulnerable to manipulation, critics argue that a flawed list threatens the very foundation of free and fair elections. Call for reform, including the use of biometrics and stronger verification mechanisms, have grown louder. But legal roadblocks, partisan battles, and institutional inertia have left the process fraught with uncertainty. Today we ask, what will it take to safeguard the 2025 ballot in Guyana and the Caribbean? Is the region doing enough to secure electoral integrity in this critical democratic moment? The question of electoral integrity isn't an isolated question that applies only to Guyana. Across the Caribbean, 2025 is shaping up to be a pivotal year for democratic governance. Several countries are either preparing for or have recently held elections that could reshape political landscapes and affect regional cooperation. From Jamaica's upcoming polls to Suriname's recent political changes and Trinidad and Tobago's shifting party dynamics, the stakes have never been higher. These developments cast a spotlight on the challenges electoral commissions face in ensuring free, fair, and credible elections under increasing social and economic pressures.
Building on that, the electoral landscape across the Caribbean reflects a complex interplay of political transitions, emerging parties and voter expectations for transparency and fairness. Many countries are wrestling with outdated voter registration systems, questions over electoral preparedness, and demands for modernization, especially in an era of digital tools and biometric technologies. As we focus on Guyana, it's critical to understand these regional trends that highlight both shared challenges and opportunities for strengthening democracy. In this episode, we'll explore how Guyana's experiences can serve as a bellwether for wider Caribbean electoral reform and resilience.
Joining us are GECOM's Commissioners Vincent Alexander and Clement Rohee, regional expert and former communications consultant with CARICOM Calvin G. Brown, who served as a former regional director in the office of the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Also with us, Dr. Terrence Blackman. Dr. Blackman is a Guyanese-born mathematician and analyst who is the founding dean of the School of Science, Health, and Technology at Medgar Evers College in New York. He is a prolific commentator on Caribbean governance and development. This is Caribbean Tea. Let's begin. Gentlemen, welcome to Caribbean Tea.
Thank you.
Before we get into the meat of the issues we want to address today, let's take a regional pulse, starting with St. Vincent. Kendall.
Yes, as you said, like Guyana and Jamaica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is in a state of preparedness for general elections widely expected by November this year. The contest is expected to be a straight fight between the ruling Unity Labour Party of Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves and the main opposition New Democratic Party led by lawyer Dr. Godwin Friday. I think of regional interest would be the effort by the incumbent Prime Minister Dr. Ralph Gonsalves to get a sixth consecutive term in office, something that I think would be a first in the Caribbean if it were to happen. He has been in office since 2001 and has had 5 consecutive terms. Or if the opposition New Democratic Party of Dr. Godwin Friday will win the confidence of the Vincentian electorate, who are with the party saying that it is time for the country to go in a new direction. The issue that we're discussing today has not surfaced as a main issue in the campaign so far. That is the voters list issue, which I know is an issue across the Caribbean. It's not a major issue, but it has surfaced where some voters have become displaced by the damage done to housing last July by Hurricane Beryl, which affected several Caribbean countries, and especially in the Grenadines, which got the brunt of the effects of the heavy winds from Beryl. Some of the residents are still located on mainland, and I know that the main opposition party had met with the supervisor of elections to raise certain issues related to whether they can vote outside of their constituency, since St. Vincent and the Grenadines, like most of the rest of the Caribbean, but excluding Guyana, operate in the first past the post system with their constituencies. And so that is expected to be an issue leading right up to the general elections. The incumbent is concluding its selection of candidates, and that has been the focus for them, while the main opposition has been holding a series of village meetings or rallies to continue to spread their message of change for the country.
Seems a good time for us to bring in our expert and consultant from Jamaica, Calvin Brown. Welcome to Caribbean Tea, Calvin. How things are shaping up in Jamaica?
Jamaica is shaping up to be quite interesting. We don't have a difficulty or challenge that is present in the Guyana example. However, what we have here is that the elections have not been called. However, the campaigning is very, very, very high. We have not a lot of electoral violence. However, there is electoral sparring. Let's put it that way. Right now, the Electoral Commission that is now acting as the ombudsman, and again, you don't know how it is working or whether it is working. The opposition will tell you that the ombudsman, on the basis of the Electoral Commission acting out as the ombudsman, is not working. However, the government will tell you that, listen, as far as we're concerned, it's working. But apart from that, we're hoping that the polls, well, we are expecting the polls in September. The government is signaling that they want a couple more a couple more months and may take it down into December. The opposition PNP, headed by Mark Golding, is saying, we want the elections now. But I think the government headed by Andrew Holness is being very careful as to when he calls the election and the signals he is giving as to when the elections will be.
Thank you very much, Calvin. And Jamaica also has a history in the past of some level of electoral trauma. Guyana, in particular, has a history of electoral trauma. But even with that history, the 2020 election took things to a new height. Dr. Blackman, what's your take on how the trauma the country goes through during the election period might have affected its development post-independence?
There's no question that the post-election world of Guyana is traumatic, and it has significantly impacted the nation's ability to and to move as quickly as it ought to have moved. I think recently I chatted with one of our historians, and we reflected on all of the elections and the bet that we could make as reasonable people is that the election in 2025 will be disputed. There will be conflict, and following that, there will be a number of issues which, had this been done in an appropriate manner, was there trust in this process, we would have evidently sort of moved much further forward. I think this question that you're raising about electoral integrity is a really, really important one. And I think the question that you opened up, a source of that trauma is the root of the question that you sort of framed the program around, the voters. I think that's the point. What does the voter registration numbers tell us about electoral integrity and the possibility for trauma? And I think, as you begin to unfold this, I think the story will be clear.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blackman. I want to throw it out to our panel before we proceed. We keep hearing very often this whole idea of free and fair elections. There isn't a concrete definition as to what constitutes free and fair. Do you have any thoughts as to what should be expected, what should be present for elections to be free and fair? In other words, how should we define free and fair elections?
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was about to say, I've been looking at these data sets in relation to your question of free and fair and electoral integrity, and I think they raise some fundamental questions about democratic governance, certainly in our region broadly, but in Guyana in particular. The first question I wanted to sort of throw to our panel is how do we explain Guyana's 2020 registration of about 660,000 voters against a population of 800,000? That's over 80% of the total population. International norms range 3%, Brazil 71%. So what does it mean when a country's figures fall so far outside of these benchmarks? Are they numbers that are statistically credible? And then what issues do they raise around the question of governance, democratic governance in a region, and in particular in Guyana? So I'd start there.
Mr. Brown?
Yeah, in terms of the definition, In Jamaica, we say one man, one vote, same man, same vote. And that's as close to a good definition as you can get. One person, one vote, the same person, the same vote.
If I may jump in, where the famous aspect of the question that Vivian asked in relation to free and fair elections, how do you see the what's perceived as an advantage of incumbency affecting the prospect of free and fair elections, where, for instance, in Jamaica, you hear of a number of openings of and ribbon cutting. In fact, there was a very popular exchange on that where the opposition was claiming that the prime minister has cut so many ribbons that he missed and cut the ribbon of one of a school. And where there are resources, government resources, and I know the question is raised here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where the resources seem to be added to the incumbent party's campaign. How does that equate to being, a fair election?
Interesting. And in Jamaica, the government has been in power for the past 9-10 years. They have the resources, and they control the media. They control the communications. You have a challenge as to how do you separate the party from the government? And when is it that the party is advertising, as opposed to when is it that the government is making an announcement or giving information to the public? So you, Kendall, would have a challenge in St. Vincent, because Ralph's been there from quite some time, and the opposition is at a loss as to how to challenge the government in terms of what they're doing, what they should have done, and what is fair comment, what is fair advertising, and what is government advertising. So we have a problem there. And as long as you are the government is in power, you have a challenge there.
I certainly agree with the fact that because the Caribbean in general, smaller societies, the ability to distinguish between the actions of the party and the actions of the government are very difficult, and they quite frequently blur in almost all of these jurisdictions. We see this, quite clearly in Guyana, where it's often very difficult to distinguish between the government's actions and the party's actions. I mean, the vice president holds a Thursday press conference that is held at the party's office. The president is not quite frequently holding the press conference from the State House office. So this is definitely a challenge for Caribbean democracy, and I also want to raise the issue of within the context of a country like Guyana, which I think is somewhat different in terms of its racial and ethnic from the other countries. What you have in the case of Guyana really amounts to a kind of tribal, ethnic, sort of racial census every 5 years. So the question of, is it one man, one vote, same man, same vote, while on the surface it reflects a certain kind of democratic tendency, within the context of Guyana and its constitution, it really does have a kind of authoritarian, and many of the folks around the Caribbean recognize this, really does have a kind of democratic authoritarian sort of 51% of the vote, which is essentially kind of a demographic reality, then does not have to work with the 49% that did not vote for him. And so, the question of whether or not that is a legitimate democracy within the context of the lives of the people in Guyana is something that I've always grappled with. And so this is why I think the structural machinery of how elections get done, how votes get counted, who is an eligible elector, etc., I think takes on a very serious note within the context of Guyana for effective representation of citizens of Guyana.
Well, one of the longest running controversies in Guyana's electoral history revolves around the voters list. Critics have described it as bloated, containing significantly more names than the estimated adult population. Let's bring in now Commissioners Vincent Alexander and Clement Rohee over to Kendall for that discussion.
Thanks, Vivian. And as you said, it's one of the longest running controversies in Guyana's electoral history. The issue of the voters list, which some critics have described as being bloated and containing significantly more names than the overall population of the country. And of course, that has triggered ongoing concerns about the potential for electoral fraud. But the path to reform has been complicated. The court has ruled definitively that house-to-house registration cannot be used to remove registered voters from the National Register. That means cleansing the list through deletion is legally off the table unless people voluntarily deregister or are removed due to verified death or disqualification. I want to start with you, Mr. Alexander. Commissioner, you've been one of the loudest voices in the opposition-nominated faction of the Commission, raising alarms about the credibility of the list. Given the legal roadblocks, what in your view is the solution? Can biometrics provide the kind of verification needed to safeguard the vote?
First of all, let me say the credibility of the list is associated with the fact that our list seems to exceed the actual population or the population of voters. Not only does it exceed the population of voters, but there has been credible evidence which has not been refuted and was verified by relevant authorities that at the elections 2020, votes were cast for persons who were not in the country. And among those persons, there could well be scores of thousands of them who are dead persons with absolutely no provision for the removal of those dead from the list. The evidence of what occurred in 2020, the mischief is not the list itself. The mischief is the misuse of the list. Misuse of the list meaning that people, somehow or the other, are able to cast votes for names which are on the list, although the persons who carry those names are not present. It is in that context that one has to see what mechanisms can be used given the fact that we've arrived at a situation where we cannot have periodic renewal of the list. We cannot have periodic renewal. In other words, we can't create a new list. Our list that we presently have was first created in 2008, and we're just building on it. And so from that perspective, and from the perspective of the evidence of 2020, that the issue of biometrics becomes important. Because what biometrics does is to ensure that on one hand, we do digital registration, which will ensure that in compiling the list, we don't have duplicates. Because we do cross-matching. But if you do cross-matching with manual fingerprints, there are many instances in which the fingerprints are not good enough for cross-matching, and therefore names can go through that are duplicate because of the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of manual cross-matching. And therefore, we should really resort to digital cross-matching, which is far, far more efficient and effective in ensuring that when we digital registration, which is far more effective when it comes to cross-matching, because the digital fingerprints tend to be perfect. The system itself does not allow for smudged fingerprints. The other issue, therefore, is the question of using those digital fingerprints for the purpose of digital identification. It is at that point that one can be assured that irrespective of the size of the list, if you did digital identification, then there could be no duplicate, substitute, or fraudulent voting, because only persons who are digitally identified will be allowed to vote. And we know that digital identification does not allow for persons other than the original person to present himself and allowed into the system for the purpose of voting. And therefore, the issue really at this point in time, given the rule of the court that we can't do new registrations from ground zero, the real issue is how do you manage a list which has between 200 to 300,000 persons who are either dead and or overseas, with the overseas dead being, I would say, a significant number. How do you manage that? And to manage that is to find a way in which we do not have the possibility of people turning up to vote for either the overseas persons or the dead persons. And we are now saying this in the context of evidence being produced in 2020 of votes being cast for persons who were not in the country, and those may be live or dead persons. And us not paying attention to this accusation and trying to find ways and means to alleviate ourselves in this accusation, contending that our systems are perfect when the accusation and the level of verification suggests our systems are not perfect, and therefore the need for rectification, and the proposal that biometrics is indeed what can be used for rectification of the mischief.
Rohee, you represent the governing party, the PPP Civic on the Commission, and the party has consistently stated that the current procedure used to generate the list produced credible elections in the past, including when the opposition won in 2015. But with growing calls for biometric verification, fingerprint or facial recognition at polling stations, what is the governing party's commissioner's stance on this?
Let me say that the whole question of the quote-unquote bloated list has a history to that phenomena, meaning that in the year 2006, the two major political parties, People's Progressive Party and the People's National Congress came together to discuss the whole question of the prospects of holding elections without, first of all, getting the green light from GECOM, whether elections could be held or not. Because that was the practice in the past, that there's no way that an election could be proceeded with unless GECOM was the sole authority to say yes or no. Now, to overcome that problem, the whole question of continuous registration was put on the table because the two parties were of the view that anytime a government, whoever was in the government, wanted to proceed with an election based on their understanding of the political realities obtaining at that point in time, they should be allowed to do so. Whether it's in the case of general and regional elections, local government elections, or even a referendum. Because the mechanism that was in place at the time did not allow for that to happen. And that is where the whole question of continuous registration came on board. Now, continuous registration by its very nature meant that if you have 1,000 people on the list, when you start continuous registration and you continue doing that all the time, you will be continuously adding more and more people to the list. That is the whole nature of continuous registration. The PPP, since you asked about what was our position, the PPP at that meeting was represented by Mr. Donald Ramatar, Dr. Roger Lanchan, Mr. Ripudaman Prasad, and Mr. Feroz Mohammed. On the other side, they were represented by Mr. Lance Carberry and Mr. Haslin Paris. We warned that there are certain problems that would arise with continuous registration. That is to say, the whole question of the list being built up over years. What we are being faced with now is precisely the genesis of what we're being faced with now is precisely what the decision was taken after the discussion that took place in 2006. And so I don't think it is correct to say that there's nothing in place now to remove persons who have been deceased from the list. There were a few cases or a few oversights where, for example, a former president, Mr. Arthur Chung, name remained on the list for quite a long time. But the mechanism is, and I think this is international standard, that once the relatives of the deceased, meaning the very close relatives of the deceased, sees the name of the deceased person on the list, whether it's a preliminary or revised, well, it has to be a preliminary, and they have in their possession the death certificates and other relevant documentation to prove that this person is deceased. And in the claims and objections period, the person then approaches the General Register Office with the evidence to show that this person is deceased. That person's name is then included in the register of deaths. That information is transmitted to GECOM. Once that information is confirmed, then GECOM moves to the next stage to remove that person's name from the list of registrants and from the National Register of Registrants. So there is a mechanism in place. The extent to which that mechanism is being used is another matter. And it's not my intention to engage in a discussion on that at this point in time. So, three issues. One is that there's a history behind the so-called bloated list, why we have it with us now. It was a matter that was agreed between the two political, not to have a bloated list, but to have a situation put in place that would eventually result in the situation that we have now. Secondly, mechanism is in place for the removal of deceased from the list. In order for that to happen, I also pointed out that that could happen. And then finally, you have this question of biometric. Gentlemen, this is a matter that has been discussed time and time again at the level of the commission, on which there was no agreement or decision. It was only in the latter part of the run-up to the elections that a decision was taken that, look, we will examine this, we'll put this question on pause, and after the election, new situation, this matter will be brought back on the agenda of GECOM for discussion. So that is not that it has been dispensed with or put under the carpet, so to speak. It is still a live issue, but for now, for this elections, we were not able to settle on it in order for it to be put in place, so that it has been put off for another occasion, following the next election, when GECOM will return to the discussion, and in order to, with a view, hopefully, to arrive at a decision one way or the other on the matter. Now, the question was raised earlier, just quickly, Dennis. The question was raised earlier about the politics in the GECOM. This issue was one of the manifestations of how the politics influenced GECOM. But if the two political parties have positions on the question of biometrics that are diametrically opposed to each other, then obviously it would be reflected within GECOM, and that is precisely why GECOM was unable to arrive at unanimity on the subject. But like I said, that notwithstanding, the issue remains one that is yet to come back for discussion, with a view to hopefully arriving at a decision in the future.
Certainly, I can add here that, you know, I see the historical context, but you know, if one compares this with other countries, like noted earlier, Antigua and Barbuda, 60.7% of the population is registered. The Bahamas, 46.8% of the population registered. Brazil, 73.1% of the population. The United Kingdom, 70.9%. So I think these problems that have been identified by the two commissioners, you know, dead voters on the lists, multiple voting allegations, overseas citizens named being used for fraudulent votes, and then by Commissioner Rohee, the lack of proper list cleaning and maintenance. I think what they have not mentioned is that situation, to your earlier question about democratic governance, is that situation creates really fertile ground for electoral manipulation. And I would add one point before I close here. In thinking about this, I think we should, after the 2020 elections, the CARICOM recount team recommended a complete re-registration of all of the voters as a minimum requirement. And it is perhaps not surprising that CARICOM has remained silent on that implementation, and maybe the local legal regime trumps this CARICOM recommendation. But certainly, I think, you know, implementing something as called for by a broad regional body as a result of having to intervene in a potentially tenuous situation says something about where we are relative to the kind of measures that would be necessary to ensure election and electoral integrity.
Calvin, you have been observing this. Jamaica has its own elections commission. Considering what takes place in Jamaica, your understanding of the dynamics in the region generally, What's your reaction?
We have a continuous registration system, and we have 63 constituencies, and in each constituency there is an electoral commission office. There's an electoral office where people can go in, register. Once they reach the age of 18, they go, they register. People come to their homes to verify that those who are registering or have registered live where they say they live, and they are the same people who they say they are. After that process is entered into, they give them an identification that today operates as a government-issued identification in the absence of anything else, like a passport, but that's a valid government-issued identification. And a lot of young people go and register because they want that identification. Your electoral facility is the ID. Now, I hear Dr. Blackman, and it is a pet peeve of mine whenever you have the opposition says anything in respect of that. I said, listen, during the 2020 elections, CARICOM committed to ensuring that whatever the problems are in terms of the list, they would have been in the position to lobby for and lobby with in order to ensure that the 2025 situation does not catch them. Nobody has written to CARICOM, neither the opposition nor the government, to say, listen, you made a promise. We are holding you to this. And it sits there.
In relation, Mr. Brown, to the list, you said there's continuous registration.
Yes.
In terms of, is there any effort to clean the list, and are there concerns? Is there any mechanism for removing dead people and migrants from the list? And is there a concern that these, as was raised by the commissioners from Guyana, that the presence of dead people and people overseas can be used to create mischief?
Okay. Very, very, very interesting. There is a process to move dead people. Once persons, the registration in the constituency, once they find out that John Tom has died, and they are able to verify that, the office deals with it and move them out. In respect of people overseas, what we have is that people overseas will come in and register, have their ID, and come and vote. The process where people will impersonate other persons has been minimized tremendously. So when you're voting, everybody needs to have their electoral ID.
I wanted to also get a quick response from Dr. Blackman on this. You've spoken about and agree that the list is bloated, but the next step of using the opportunity to misuse the bloated list, as raised by Commissioner Alexander, And I know that some of the responses to that has been that with polling agents by the major political parties being present, that it would minimize the opportunity for that to happen. What's your take on the opportunity for misusing this bloated list that we all seem to agree that that exists?
No, I have no doubt that the bloated list creates fertile ground for electoral manipulation. And I think Commissioner Alexander alluded to some very concrete instances of same. Whether those are material in terms of swinging the election one way or another. I think it could be if you're looking at 200,000 people on the list who are technically voters but are not really there to cast a vote on their own behalf. So I do think Commissioner Alexander's, biometric solution is really perhaps the most important thing that can be done within the context of Guyana. And it is unfortunate that the biometric voter verification is not going to be possible for the 2025 elections for many of the reasons that were mentioned, the legal hurdles and some of the technical hurdles that have been identified by the GECOM folks. But I must say that in this context, I think we've missed an opportunity here in this regard. I think the GECOM estimates that biometric verification would cost about $20 or so million. Within the context of Guyana's oil wealth, this is really a modest investment for a small nation. And technical solutions exist with known constitution pathways. So, what's really preventing the implementation? Is this a capacity issue or is it a political choice? And again, I come back to the earlier question. In some sense, we have resources for everything else, but why do we not have resources for electoral integrity?
I would like to have you gentlemen respond to the issue of the bloated list in this way. The theory here is that if you have a large number of people on the list who don't actually exercise their franchise, that opens the door for others who are present to exercise a franchise for those who didn't choose to exercise their franchise. Viewed in that context, in the United States, for instance, a high percentage of persons who are eligible to vote don't vote. But we don't hear the issue in the United States that those who choose not to vote, that their vote or their right to vote is manipulated in a way that makes the elections in the United States compromised. Now, I want us to address that in the context of this, that of the great number of people on that list we call bloated are people in the diaspora who have, based upon the court and the Constitution, have a right to vote just as anyone present. So when we think of sanitizing the list, we surely cannot think of a process of disenfranchisement of persons in the diaspora who would wish to participate in the governance of their country. The question seems to be therefore limited to a procedure to remove persons who are dead locally and overseas, to have those dead voters, dead persons' names removed from the list. But again, I'm sort of making a comment here and then asking you to address it. But if the problem is the manipulation of dead diaspora Guyanese within the local environment, can there also be manipulation of living Guyanese? And I'd like to hear from you, and I may have a follow-up.
I'll wait and have my colleague respond first, and then I'll respond.
Calvin, your thoughts? Any thoughts here?
Listen, it's for me. It's not a. It's a matter of political will. There is no political will right now. In terms of the government to deal with this matter. It's 5 years since the last elections, just about. Clement Rohee is going to tell me that, boy, this happened or that happened. Clearly, Clement knows that they just do not want to deal with this matter. It can be done. If it can happen in Jamaica, it can happen in Guyana. Right now, we have 2 million voters on the list in Jamaica. And we don't have a problem. We have very, very little problem in terms of dead people. People overseas who want to vote, they can come and vote if they have their electoral ID. There is nothing monumental in this. It's just a matter of electoral and political will.
Dr. Blackman?
And really, Clement has to, Rohee, he really has to come better than what he's doing.
Dr. Blackman?
Yeah, I share some of what was just said, but to give the context, the American context that you so I think it's clear, and there's reason for it. We just had the commissioner, the election commissioner, saying to us that there has been some evidence of fraud in this context, right? So, but I think this is a different situation from what occurs in the United States. So, low voter turnout among eligible voters will not raise or typically raise the concerns about integrity of the process, in large part because of robust verification mechanisms and longstanding trust in the system, right? I think we only have to look at the last election cycle to see what happens when trusts start to erode. Donald Trump did not accept that he lost the election. And certainly some of that mistrust in the election, he too quite, said, immigrants were on the list and they voted and a number of things, but at least it doesn't happen here in part because there is still a significant measure of trust and a significant robustness of the verification mechanisms. In the Caribbean context, lack of effective mechanisms to regularly update and clean the voters lists, to remove deceased people or those who have permanently migrated, creates vulnerabilities. And I think we should recognize that. And that these vulnerabilities are really compounded by historical mistrust in the electoral process and the perception, and sometimes the reality of manipulation, right? Mm-hmm. And within the context of Guyana, we also have this racial ethnic dynamic. I want to be clear, though, that the legal right of folks in the diaspora to vote is important, and that ought to be safeguarded. But I also do think that we need some strong safeguards, such as the sort of biometric verification that has been, to prevent the abuse of the thing that's there. So, your question is, the mere presence of non-voting eligible voters on the list is not inherently problematic. The key issue is whether the electoral system has the sufficient checks to prevent their names from being misused. And we've seen that in Guyana in similar contexts. That process needs strengthening.
I like that response, because that's what I'm going at, that there isn't the conversation is usually about a bloated list, but the issue is not so much about the size of the list or the presence of persons in the diaspora. The question is about policing the system, whether there is adequate policing of the system to ensure those whose name are on the list and choose not to, for one reason or the other, presence or being apathetic, that those rights are not exercised by others. I think Mr. Alexander sort of stressed that when he emphasized the importance of biometrics. But I think it's important for the audience to recognize that. Let's go back to the commissioners and see how they address one of the mechanisms through which there is some ought to be some level of policing, and that is the voter verification process. So let's go back to them, and then we'll come back and talk again.
So, Commissioners Rohee and Alexander, being long-standing politicians and understanding the political machinery of Guyana as a whole, not necessarily specific to the parties to which you're affiliated, I would like you to tell us how is it that the claims and objections periods are not yielding the large number of persons who should be off the list? Why is it so? Isn't this an opportunity for the parties, field workers, to go out and find out whether people are living here or there, they're died, they're migrated, and therefore they can file an objection and have these names removed? How is it that this system that's provided for by GECOM not working to cleanse the list?
First of all, let me say that the system which is working is not necessarily the claims and objections that are being referred to. The General Registrar of Births and Deaths is the recipient of information on the people who are deceased. And they do send to us periodically lists of the deceased, and those are taken off of the list. So that's not a problem. The problem is that their system does not capture all of the people who have died. And so you have the retention of names on the list of people who have died. Those people are in two categories: local people and foreign people. In terms of the local people, there is a proposal for us to use information from the police and information from the chief medical officer to supplement information from the GRO, to have names which are not recorded with the GRO taken off of the list if reported to be dead by the police and or the chief medical officer. Unfortunately, GECOM has spent weeks upon weeks discussing the mechanism for realizing what that law provides for, a law of 2022. How do we go about doing what the law says we should do? Take the names off if they're reported on by the chief medical officer or the commissioner of police. We have not resolved the problem because though the administration initially came up with a methodology, it has been questioned. And so as we approach these elections, the names of persons who are not brought to our attention as being dead by the GRO will remain on the list. Bearing in mind the second category of people, and that is the largest category, and people tend not to pay attention to it. The overseas dead, we do not, claims and objectives does not deal with the overseas dead. There's no mechanism, absolutely no mechanism to deal with the overseas dead. And there are scores of thousands in that category that remain on our list. When it comes to claims and objections, that requires that a death certificate is produced, and it requires for persons who have access to the death certificate to go and do an objection. And the evidence suggests that there aren't many persons who use that process. Don't ask me why, but the fact of the matter is, if you check our stats, there aren't many persons who use that process. So that process is in itself also seemingly ineffective. But may I emphasize, in relation to quote unquote the bloated list, the majority of people on that list who are of concern are overseas dead who are in the scores of thousands.
Mr. Alexander, as I have you, then how do you arrive at this assumption that scores of thousands, to use their exact words, of people who are on the list are those persons who are overseas if you do not have any specific data gathering mechanism? And point two of the question, what is the purpose of the objections period or the claims and objections period? Because we saw at least 2 or 3 cases brought by the opposition to the court, and when the judge asked for the evidence to support the case that there are people who are out there who should not be in the list, there was no evidence. So what's the purpose? What's the basis?
First of all, it doesn't even require statistics for us to know that if we are doing registration of Guyanese from 2008 to present, that every Guyanese present in the country was entitled to be registered. That's the first point. Secondly, it doesn't require statistics for us to know that many of those Guyanese, many hundreds and scores of thousands have migrated, and therefore their names are on the list, having migrated, but haven't been registered for a period between 2008 and 2025. That we don't have statistics is not true. There are some deductions which can be done. If
But
you
have
have a
these
population,
deductions been presented to the commission as hard evidence?
if you have a population of 750,000, which is the latest figure that we have officially, and you have a school population of approximately 200,000, which is the latest figure we have officially, then your voters list should be in the vicinity of 500 and something thousand. Any addition to that can only be people who are not in the country, because the 750 are in the country and the 200 in the country. So there is a deduction that tells you, yes, there are scores of people overseas who were registered are on the list. We also have the source of information is available. The National Registration Act provides for the Chief Immigration Officer periodically to provide GECOM with a list of names of people who have departed and have not returned. It was that list that was used by the Chief Immigration Officer to determine that the names allegedly voted for were names of persons who were not in the country. And this is factual information I'm dealing with here in that regard. It is that authority of that officer that allowed for comparisons to be made in relation to the allegations and the actual data, and to say, yes, of these allegations, and only a fraction of the allegations were tested, but of that fraction, in each instance, 75% of the people were listed as not being in the country. Now, when it comes to claims and objections, let us be reminded that that does not deal with overseas Guyanese. So all who died overseas, there's no mechanism to remove them. It does deal with local Guyanese, and it's a voluntary exercise. The people who normally do objections are normally political stakeholders who want to get somebody named off the list. The family don't come forward. You hardly have families coming forward and say, my family died, here's the birth death certificate. The people who come forward are the people who have an interest in ensuring that the dead do not cast a vote. And they are ineffective because they have to have the birth certificates. And they don't have the death certificates, and they don't have them. So that system of claims and objections
Thank you.
turns out to be ineffective.
Mr. Rohee.
Two ways of quickly dealing dispensing with that argument is one, so long as a person's name is on that voters list, that person, whether they're living overseas, whether they're living in Guyana, they are entitled to vote. Residency is not a requirement to be a voter. You can be a resident in New York, you can be a resident in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you could be a resident in any part of the country. Since your name continues to be on that list and you're alive, you can return, be entitled to cast your vote. Number one. Number two, it was precisely this list. I don't mean the RLE for this 2025, I mean the list that we're hearing now, that is bloated for so many years, that allowed or that was used in order for the PNC, APNU-AFC to be elected to office in 2015 and in 2011 to get a minority representation in the parliament. When they had the minority representation in the parliament, never did they raise that question, that the list was at fault. When they won government in 2015, never did they raise the argument that the list was at fault. They were happy. That's okay. Now, this question of a bloated list, quote unquote, being raised. Now, we had over 2,000 polling stations in the 2020 election, almost the same amount in 2011. PNC had polling agents in almost all of those polling stations. GECOM had elections officials in all of those polling stations. Political parties that had the capacity had polling agents in all of the polling stations. Now, I would like to find out from Mr. Alexander, how is it a person could walk into a polling station and claim to be representing a person who is deceased, or claim to be a person who is living overseas, whose name is on the list, and they're being allowed to vote twice because they can vote for themselves and have their fingers stained with indelible ink and then come back again to vote for somebody else, with all those people sitting there and observing what is happening. In addition to that, GECOM officials and the polling agents have the relevant documents to see the photos, the names of the persons after the ID numbers are called to identify the person that is going to cast their ballot. I'm saying to you, gentlemen, that this whole question of a bloated quote-unquote list is an argument that is being advanced to support a political objective. And the political objective has been massaged now to the whole question of biometrics. I already explained that the question of biometrics has not been thrown out of the window. It's going to come back. And I'm sure APNU representatives who will be there, they will ensure that it's brought back because it's in the records. So, for 2020, those lists were used, 2015, 2011, and for local government elections, which was just in 2023, I think, those lists were used again. So, there was no question of a bloated list on those occasions. Those lists made them win Linden, made them win Georgetown, made them win New Amsterdam, made them win a number of NDCs and RDCs.
So there we heard again from the commissioners dealing really with this whole question of verification, which seems to be the one mechanism to address the issue of abuse of the list, or the mischief, as Mr. Alexander has said, and the other issue of the scrutineers at the polling stations. Having listened to both sides, what's your takeaway?
So, look, it's clear as has been identified that the claims and objections is to allow our stakeholders, political parties, family members, general public, etc., to challenge the inclusion of ineligible names on the voters list, the deceased, migrated, etc. In theory, right, this process should help to keep the list accurate and up to date. But as has been identified, several challenges limit the effectiveness of what was described. Look, limited participation. Commissioner Alexander talked about, the process relying heavily on individuals and, political stakeholders to come forward with, death certificates and so on. My father died 2 years ago, and as I was listening to I was trying to think, where is the death certificate? And he's absolutely right. Family members rarely participate in something like this. What he notes clearly is that there's no mechanism for the overseas deceased, right? So there's literally, I wrote that down. There is no process for folks who died. He describes the chief medical officer and the commissioner of police. I mean, there's clearly incomplete data, and more. I think this voluntary nature of the process. So certainly, as a result, this claims and objections process, it's certainly well intentioned, but I think it's clearly not sufficient on its own to maintain a clean and credible voters list in Guyana. I think Commissioner Rohee takes the tack that, look, you won with a not so clean list before. This time I won, and so in some very real sense, because we've had this, we don't need a proactive and systematic approach to or the use of biometrics or any legal reforms to systematically address these persistent challenges. And so I think they're both taking a somewhat sort of party level view. And what I hope is that they can both realize that it is in the interest of Guyana, so to speak, given our own sort of traumatic history, to have a situation that people can genuinely feel that that there is more trust in that system. So more trust means, not saying like he did sort of glibly, I'm not disagreeing on biometrics, but you're just not going to have biometrics now. You're going to have biometrics next year. And who says whether you're going to have biometrics next year? So I think that pushing the discussion in that direction beyond, it's interesting. We've come back to sort of this earlier point about kind of separating out the interests of the party as distinct from the national interests. I think it is in Guyana's national interests to have a more proactive and systematic approach to this question of voter verification. And it might not be, or it will be in the party's interest, depending on whether or not in government, to decide that it's not in their interest. But that's how I would respond.
My question is there a re-registration process? You cannot, in 2006, have a registration, and in 2025, there is no re-registration process. It can't work that way. There must be a re-registration process. For example, again, right now in Jamaica, the re-registration process has almost concluded. There was a list on the 31st of May, and you had to be on that list. You had to re-register for the 2 months before in order to be on the 31st of May list. If you're not on that list, the next list will be out on November 30. And if you're not on there, life is rough. You have to wait until the other one. But you must have a re-registration process. And that will help you to clean the list.
I would like to make a comment before we move on to this next, before we bring the commissioners back in. And I'd like to say this, that the court has actually ruled, and this is the Chief Justice has ruled, that you couldn't strike names off the list. And that gives the impression that once you register once, your name just recurs on the list. The comment that I want to make is that in Guyana, institutions have not been sufficiently tested. And the interpretation that the Chief Justice has given to the Constitution, one, it was not appealed to the highest court. And I think when you have matters of this magnitude, you want the issue to be percolated right up to the highest court. And in that process of percolation, the court might have given some rationale, some level of reasoning, and some refinement of the decision that achieves what the Chief Justice ruled, that persons outside of the jurisdiction in the diaspora still have the right to vote, but not in a way that gives rise to this problem that the country has. And that has not been done. I think it was unfortunate that the decision was not taken to the highest level for full percolation of this very significant issue. The other point that I wish to make is that there was a similar decision in 1999 where resulting in the government having to step down and hold fresh elections. That was a decision of the first instance, and that also did not percolate itself to the highest court. And when you have a country operating like that, the Constitution is not given sufficient oxygen to breathe because there isn't sufficient robustness of interpretation of what the framers of the Constitution intend and how the language of the Constitution could breathe life into a functioning democracy. I want to make that comment, and I want now for us to bring the commissioners back in and listen to them, and then we'll go to wrap up.
Anyone has ever raised this question of the system being perfect? Perfection is a relative issue. There's no absolute perfection. There's always room for improvement. In fact, the government recognized room for improvement after the 2020 election, when a number of amendments were made to the Representation of the People's Act to improve the electoral system. For example, changes were made in regions 4, 5, and 6, I think. So that you have those regions now that are large have been divided up into sub-regions, sub-districts. So there are a number of new amendments that were made to the ROPA, called the Registration of People, to address some of the issues. The point I'm making, gentlemen, is that electoral systems in any country, as a matter of fact in Guyana, is an evolving one, so that once it identified that changes or corrections or whatever the case is made, they are made, but they must be made in accordance with the law. But in the parliament, voted on and sent it to by whoever the president might be. So there's a process to everything. I am saying that the bottom line of every process or every step we take, it has to be buttressed the laws of the country. Cannot engage it. Elections is not a question of engaging in speculation or drawing conclusions without evidence. You're dealing here now with political power. And that is precisely why the process has to be so transparent and accountable, because much is at stake. The question that is at stake here, in any country, has to do with who will get control of political power. I'm saying you don't mess with something like that, because there can be trouble in a country or in the country. Don't think GECOM is going to do that in order to create chaos in this country.
One, it is only in 2019 that we took off of our agenda the question of renewing the voters list. Up to 2019, it was possible. In fact, in 2019, we started the house to house to renew the voters list from ground zero, and it was only because of court action that that renewal was not done. So to suggest that we just continuous registration meant that we were not going to renew the list, it's not true. 2019, all the parties in parliament appropriated money to renew the list, but a court action by one party subsequently dealt that a blow. Secondly, this whole question of the system and its perfection, there is evidence that it did not work. There is a level of verification that it did not work. The Attorney General has corralled all of the evidence and has refused to have it tested. And what my contention is, forget about all that talk about people being in the polling station and all of that. Let us go to the factual evidence and do the verification for and or against. Because GECOM refused to do an evaluation of its systems, which evaluation would have helped us to know if there are flaws. Because this question of credibility of the list is not an APNU issue. Barra Jagdeo in 2015 made the same call with the same accusations. So it rings hollow for you in 1 year to say one biometrics, that the system is flawed, that the elections were rigged, and 5 years after to say you don't want biometrics for technical reasons. So all of us have contended, all the parties have contended that the perfect system is flawed. All of the parties have called for biometrics. Some have been more consistent than others. And that is what has become the source of the problem, the inconsistency in confronting an acknowledged problem.
Mr.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I don't want to get involved in a back and forth, but I don't think it is correct to say that the question of biometric for technical reasons we'd run out of time. We'd run out of time. We'd already started preparing the action plan.
That was contrived.
For the 2025 elections.
That was contrived. I raised
there was no
in 2023.
I don't agree with it. I don't want to use the word reject strong, but I don't agree. Argument biometrics was dispensed with or put on pause by GECOM for technical reasons. It was put on pause because we were running out of time, had discussions ad nauseum on this subject, could not reach agreement, and in the public domain, public space, political actors were not agreeing on the issue. And as practical politicians, we would know that once there's disagreement in the public domain among the political entities, that translates itself into GECOM precisely because of the makeup of GECOM. We want to talk about change in GECOM, but then brings us, which I don't want to go there as yet because it has not been raised, the question of constitutional reform.
Mr. Rohee, in order to end this controversy over the list, the quality of the list, whether it's bloated or not bloated, you, Mr. Rohee, do you believe, or do you support the idea of the Constitution and the relevant laws being amended to pave the way for a total re-registration of all Guyanese here?
Well, just now, Commissioner Alexander raised the question that one party took court.
Let's
Stop.
put that aside. I'm asking you.
No. I'm answering your question in the context. I always like to do things contextually because there's always a history to something that we have to take the totality into consideration. So Commissioner Alexander raised that question that the court order stopped the new house-to-house registration. But I think you would recall, as well as Commissioner Alexander would recall, that it was his party that took to court a request for the whole question of ID cards not to be used, and that the use of the introduction of ID cards was an illegal mechanism that was introduced in the electoral process. And we know what was the result of that. Now, to come back to your question, that would be a question that when that Constitutional Reform Commission is put in place, they will then move around the country. No, that I'm talking.
Well, why we can't get to Clement Rohee's position?
Because as a member of the public and as a person who is associated with the People's Progressive Party, I might have my own view
And that is what
on
I
that
want to
subject.
hear.
No, but I would not want to invite to express that view publicly. When it comes to a discussion on that matter internally, I will express my view whether constitutional reform should take into consideration that matter or any other matter. But I do not want it to be recorded that Commissioner Rohee has gone out there to insist that should the constitutional reform commence its work, which it has already done in fact, one of the issues you should take on board is the question of this other issue.
I got your answer there, Mr. Rohee. And Mr. Alexander, very quickly, you've talked so much about evidence coming out of the 2020 elections about people who were not in Guyana at the time of voting. But you should recall also that there were people who had come out in the public domain, in the media, saying that they were here. In fact, one of them was an observer who produced his badge, saying that he was on election day in Guyana observing. How do you reconcile that as far as evidence is concerned?
Very, very simple.
How?
The list which was compiled by the APNU, sent to GECOM and passed on to the Chief Immigration Officer for verification, was verified. And in the verification process, dealing with the specific names, 75% were verified. Not all were verified. So to have one or two persons come forward and say, I was here, is in consonance with the outcome of the verification process.
Okay. I hear you, and I want if you can probably take on board. I'm trying to get a graph here shared, Vivian. I don't know if you can facilitate it because you're actually the moderator. But if you don't, I would like to draw to Mr. Alexander and to Mr. Rohee's attention. There being statistics that have been produced by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which basically shows that notwithstanding concerns about the size of the voters' lists, that basically the number of people who turn out to vote on elections day are well below the number of registered voters. For instance, in the last elections, 480,061 people voted. In 2015, 412,012 persons voted as opposed to 570,708. Do you believe, Mr. Alexander, given the statistics that are available with respect to the actual turnout versus the number of persons who are registered, that your claim of a list being bloated is really that really has any basis?
That statistics you refer to has not confuted the fact, it's not refuted the fact that we have a list that is in excess of the residents in this country. That statistics doesn't refute that. What
But
it says that is a turnout of a certain number.
and
The
it's
extent
almost constant over the last since 1992. It's almost constant.
the turnout does not tell you how many of those people who turned up were the actual original individuals or people who might have been involved in multiple voting. The turnout does not tell you that. And the extent to which there is information which says, by name, here are names that were voted for, that was verified, tells you you cannot rely on that slim information for the purpose of which you seem to want to rely on it. You cannot.
And where are
And
your
when you
polling
see,
agents? Where are your polling agents and your polling day staff? Don't they verify who signs off with the statements of poll at the end of the day?
for me, if you have a system where at the end of the day there is evidence, then all it says that something is wrong with all that you were talking about. That's all it says. It does not mean that all that you were talking about negates a fact that verification has been done of people who have done duplicate voting. So we have to start from that fact and work back down. GECOM refused to do that. When we called for an evaluation of the system, GECOM refused to do it. When the Attorney General collects the information, the allegations, and he has at his disposal the state machinery to go to immigrations and do the verification, and over 2 years he refuses to do it, why are you asking me to support the argument that you have a whole set of perfect systems that cannot be overridden? When my contention is, one, they have been overridden, and there's evidence of that, and two, there is a mechanism in place for those who have an interest to prove otherwise to do so by taking those names and going to immigration and doing the relevant verification. There are thousands of names that they have. And what the AG has done, he's corralled that list for 2 years, and absolutely nothing has been done to negate the accusation or to expose the facts.
So, my first question is, from what we have heard, does it seem like the voter list issue and multiple voting or allegations of those are areas that we should expect some level of trouble and problems in the 2025 elections in Guyana?
Yeah.
Clearly.
There is, I would say, a moderate probability that the list could cause some trouble beyond the normal trouble that is part and parcel of the Guyanese election.
Alvin, you know your way around the region and have a good understanding and experience in governance in the region and also institutions in the region such as CARICOM. What is your take on this?
It is unfortunate that the two most vocal persons in 2020, Mia Motley and Ralph Gonzalez, who were very adamant and gung-ho in respect of the results of the 2020 elections. And we had the CARICOM monitoring team who made a report. What is the use of the report of the electoral monitoring team, having gone in, having observed, and you come out and it is a poor report, and you made the report that, okay, this is what we need to do, and we don't follow up on it? I am disappointed as one who has been associated with CARICOM and still feel myself associated with CARICOM because it has a job to do. And this is one of the jobs that it needs to do if it is going to have some amount of credibility going forward.
I want to come back to you, Dr. Blackman. What we are hearing is basic data problem in an oil-rich country. Is this
I would say something slightly different. I think Commissioner Clement Rohee perhaps inadvertently made the point. He says, I wrote this down. He says we're dealing with political power. Who controls political power? And this is a very important thing. And so my view is when GECOM estimates that biometric verification would cost US $20 million. I can speak to a number of infrastructure things that cost far less than $20 million. So for our modest but oil-rich nation, this data problem is not as both of the political formations have recognized. Commissioner Vincent Alexander spoke to Vice President Barajagio as being a supporter of the biometric verification. So as both of our political parties have reflected support at some level for this, one would expect that the legal issues, the constitutional pathways exist. So I think what is really preventing it, I would argue that it's not the money or the capacity to deal with the data. I would argue it's the question of, as Commissioner Rohee perhaps inadvertently noted, that this is about the power and who controls the power, and we're not going to do anything to disrupt or that could potentially call into question who might control the power. And so I think my view is that unless we get to a place where we see the question of electoral integrity not just as a technical or a legal issue, but really fundamental about trust, legitimacy, and the health of the democracy, then I think we're going to be here again asking the same questions and having the same discussion.
Gentlemen, I now want to invite you for final thoughts. What's your takeaway as we part?
This has been a truly engaging and insightful discussion we've had here today. And I think the challenge we face in Guyana, particularly with respect to this voters list, it's emblematic of the broader issues across the Caribbean. Recently I pointed out that this 24/7 in Jamaica was, everyone focused in on, Coach Darren Sammy and all the players. And what I tried to point out is that this is emblematic of the societies that have developed in the Caribbean. And there is a real gulf between where we are as a society in all of our sectors and where the world is. And part of the challenge for us is to bridge that gap. And bridging that gap means that we have to move beyond sort of, partisan interests to pursue things that are in the national good. As I'm really grateful for the comparative perspective shared by my colleagues here from Jamaica and St. Vincent. Look, this is not a problem in Jamaica, right? It is not a problem in Jamaica. So it is not a problem in St. Vincent. So there's nothing unique about Guyana that says that this has to be a problem in Guyana. So I feel that, ultimately our elections, Guyanese elections and elections across the Caribbean, and the future of these democratic institutions that we have, they depend on our sort of collective commitment to transparency and accountability, and as one of the commissioners wrote, continuous improvement. And you actually have to do it, right? So I would say, again, my thanks for being a part of the conversation, and let's leave today, resolved to keep the conversation alive and to continue to advocate for, meaningful reform in the context of building, electoral systems that would inspire us to trust and that ultimately, to your very first question, kind of genuinely reflect the true will of the people who have voted in the various jurisdictions. So I'll pause there. So just say thanks and pause there.
Calvin?
Yeah, I should also express my thanks for you to include me in this tour de force in respect of the challenge that Guyana faces. This challenge Jamaica faced about 25, 30 years ago. However, with the Electoral Commission and the people who have been put on the Electoral Commission, they decided that, listen, if we are going to go anywhere, we need to deal with it. And today, they have dealt with it. Okay, we have a little challenge here and there, but it's nothing insurmountable. It is something that we can deal with. The real problem that Guyana faces, it is something that we do not face. However, it is reflective, as Clement Rohee says, of power. Who holds the power going forward? And if we can utilize the confusion or the trauma, if you will, that surrounds this and stretch it out a little bit further and a little bit longer, those who have the resources going into the next elections may be the one who will come out victorious, and we continue this thing over and over again until we have a decision that we are going to have the political will to deal with the whole matter of how we move forward as a country in Guyana.
Dr. Blackman and Mr. Brown, thank you very much for joining Caribbean Tea. GECOM Commissioners Clement Rohee and Vincent Alexander, along with Dr. Terrence Blackman and Calvin Brown, our guests this week. This is Caribbean Tea. Thanks for joining.